1918, the world was exhausted by war. Humanity thought it had faced death, but real death, it hadn't come yet. Neither cannons nor bullets, neither tanks nor poisonous gases, a virus. It began to travel silently around the world. The war moved from the fronts to the home. This time, the enemy was invisible. This was the Spanish flu, and this story is the story of the forgotten. World War I had been raging for 4 years. Europe was filled with blood, gunpowder, and misery. Life in the trenches was inhumane. Wounds were becoming infected, bodies were rotting. Just then, on a military base in Kansas, a soldier started to develop a fever. At first, it was ignored, but within a few days, hundreds of soldiers were sick with the same symptoms: headaches, high fevers, muscle aches, and then shortness of breath, lungs filling with fluid, and sudden death. This was no ordinary flu. History is a record of humanity's struggle not only with great wars, but also with invisible enemies, epidemics. These invisible killers have influenced the rise and fall of civilizations and profoundly shaken societies. Every epidemic is a painful reminder of the power of nature and the fragility of humanity. Today we will tell you about the Spanish flu, a disaster that was overshadowed even by world wars, a catastrophe that silently wiped out millions, yet became known thanks to those who made its name known. This is not just a story of a disease, but also the lessons learned from a global crisis a century ago. Hello, valued viewers of the Echoes of History channel. In this in-depth review, we will delve behind the scenes of one of the greatest epidemics in human history. If you are ready, let's delve into the dusty pages of the past. Humanity began its struggle with epidemics long ago. The genetic traces of the Yersinia pestis bacterium that causes plague date back to approximately 3000 BC, the Neolithic period. One of the oldest known written records of plague in history appears on Hittite tablets from the 14th century BC. Sources indicate that even the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I died from this disease. The epidemic known as the Plague of Athens ravaged Athens during the Peloponnesian War, wiping out a significant portion of its population. This disaster, detailed by the historian Thucydides, is considered one of the first examples of modern epidemiology. The Antonine Plague, which began in 165 AD, was a major epidemic that profoundly affected the Roman Empire, estimated to have wiped out a quarter, and some sources even a third, of the empire's population. This plague weakened its military power and profoundly affected its political stability. The disease spread to distant lands via legionaries. However, the true devastation came with the plague of Justinian, which began in 541 AD. This was the largest known plague pandemic before the Black Death, 14th century. It afflicted the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean basin intermittently for over 200 years, causing the deaths of millions. Many historians believe that this epidemic played a significant role in the weakening of the Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. He thinks he's playing a role. Perhaps the most well-known was the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century. This terrible pandemic, which lasted from 1347 to 1351, killed more than a third of Europe's population, and in some regions, more than half, shaking the social fabric to its core. In a time when medical ignorance and superstition were widespread, the plague plunged Europe into utter chaos. The social order was overturned, the economy collapsed, and the foundations of a new world order were laid. The 19th century, however, witnessed cholera epidemics, particularly due to urbanization and poor sanitation. Millions of people lost their lives to this disease, which spread through contaminated water sources. Cholera led to revolutionary steps in public health. Dr. John Snow's cholera map in London laid the foundations of epidemiology and taught important lessons in combating future epidemics. Each epidemic forced humanity to turn to better hygiene practices, urban planning, microbiology, and medical science. However, despite all this experience, the disaster that awaited humanity at the beginning of the 20th century was far different and more insidious than any before. The Spanish flu, one of the deadliest disasters of the modern era, overlapping the devastation of World War I, had a unique story. As 1918 drew to a close, soldiers and civilians on the front lines were already ravaged by widespread devastation. While millions of young men were fighting on the front lines, an invisible enemy had begun to spread in a far more insidious and deadly way. The flu, caused by the H1N1 virus. The reason for its name, Spanish flu, is also a fascinating one. While warring countries strictly censored news that could demoralize the military or create public panic, Spain, which remained neutral, freely published news about the epidemic. Even King Alfonso XIII of Spain contracted the disease, leading to widespread coverage in the international press. This created the misconception that the epidemic first emerged in Spain. However, the true origins of the epidemic were far more complex. There are various and compelling theories about the virus's origin. The most widespread and accepted theory is that it emerged in March 1918 at Camp Funston in Kansas, United States. However, some researchers also point to military camps in France or even remote rural areas in China as possible starting points. There is also a strong possibility that the virus may have passed from poultry to humans. These ground zero debates once again highlight the complex nature of pandemics. The first wave of the virus generally presented with mild symptoms. These initial infections, which presented with ordinary flu symptoms such as fever, headache, muscle aches, and fatigue, were often mistaken for seasonal flu and were dismissed as insignificant. The first wave had low mortality rates and primarily affected the elderly and very young. But this quiet first wave was a precursor earthquake, as the virus infiltrated the human population and laid the groundwork for a more lethal return. In the summer of 1918, the virus mutated, and when it returned in the fall, it was a complete disaster. This second wave, unlike previous epidemics, specifically targeted young, healthy adults between the ages of 20 and 40. This age group, normally least affected by the flu, now had the highest mortality rates. Soldiers, college students, young families, the most active segment of the workforce, millions of people in the prime of their lives were dying within a few days. The reason the virus so severely affected this age group is still a matter of debate. The most compelling theory is that the strong and active immune systems of young adults overreacted to the virus, creating what's known as a cytokine storm. This triggers the immune system to attack its own body cells, particularly the lungs, which rapidly leads to fluid accumulation in the lungs and shortness of breath. Victims often turned purple and died of asphyxiation as their lungs filled with water. Some cases progressed so rapidly that people could wake up healthy and die in the evening. War conditions accelerated the spread of the virus at an incredible pace. The intense mobility of soldiers, crowded barracks, poor hygiene, exhausted bodies, and the psychological stress of war created the perfect breeding ground for the virus. The virus spread with soldiers from the front lines to the cities and then across the world by ship and train. Military transport vessels served as death ships in the virus's intercontinental spread. The virus quickly spread across the globe, reaching every continent from Europe to Asia, Africa to the Americas. From Iceland to Australia, from the Pacific Islands to the polar research bases, no place was completely spared from this epidemic. Even in remote Inuit villages in Alaska, the virus wreaked havoc, wiping out nearly the entire population of some villages. A third, milder wave emerged in 1919, but the deadliest period was the autumn of 1918. Cities were overwhelmed with hospitals. There were insufficient staff to care for the sick. Doctors and nurses were also contracting the disease and even dying. There was insufficient space for funerals, and even finding coffins became impossible. In some cities, the dead were forced to wait in the streets, transported by truck to mass graves. Church bells constantly tolled the news of death, but after a while their tolls would cease because so many had died and no one had run out. People wearing masks in the streets, quarantines, school and business closures, even the suspension of public transportation. These scenes, so familiar to us today, were actually present in 1918. People tried to protect themselves by their own means. Some cities banned mass gatherings to slow the spread of the epidemic, but these measures were often taken too late and were not fully implemented. The death toll from the Spanish flu is estimated to be between 50 and 100 million. This number exceeded even the death toll in World War I, and when you consider that approximately 1/3 of the world's population was infected at the time, the scale of the disaster becomes clearer. India, China, the United States, and European countries were among the regions that suffered the heaviest losses. In some regions, more than 50% of village populations lost their lives. The epidemic not only caused loss of life, but also left profound scars on societies. Millions lost their jobs, agricultural production plummeted, and factories closed, leading to economic collapse. Millions of children were orphaned, and millions of wives were widowed. Families were torn apart, and social support networks collapsed. Life expectancy in many countries dropped by more than a decade. The epidemic profoundly impacted the social and economic structure, making post-war recovery even more difficult. The medical world struggled to understand the nature of the virus and to treat it. They couldn't see the virus itself under a microscope. Antibiotics hadn't yet been discovered. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered until 10 years after the epidemic, in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, and its mass production wouldn't be available until after World War II. Although doctors and nurses worked with great dedication, there were many moments when they felt helpless. All they could do was try to alleviate symptoms, offering palliative care. Why is the Spanish flu so little remembered? There are several reasons. First, because the epidemic came so soon after World War I, it was overshadowed by the immense trauma and euphoria of victory brought on by the war. Second, government censorship of information and the lack of media coverage diminished the perceived impact of the epidemic. People wanted to forget the disaster they had experienced and focus on the future. A sense of collective amnesia ensued. However, the Spanish flu left crucial lessons for modern medicine and epidemiology. This pandemic provided a better understanding of the nature of viruses, the mechanisms by which pandemics spread, the importance of public health measures, and the necessity of global coordination. It laid the groundwork for the development of global health systems, early warning mechanisms, and vaccine research. In today's pandemics, we see the invaluable lessons learned from the Spanish flu. Vaccine development processes, global cooperation, early warning systems, and public awareness were shaped by the experiences of 1918. Humanity has learned to be stronger, more knowledgeable, and more resilient after each pandemic. Past pandemics continue to serve as guides for future preparations. The Spanish flu was a painful lesson in humanity's fragility and resilience in the face of nature. This pandemic reminds us that history is not just about great wars, it also reminds us of the profound impact invisible enemies can leave on humanity. I hope this video has helped you better understand this dark chapter in history and the lessons learned from it. Remember, learning from history allows us to face the future with greater preparedness. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share your comments. See you in the next Echoes of History video.